66%. According to a longitudinal study by Lifeway Research, 66% of American young adults who consistently occupied the pews of Protestant churches as teenagers completely vanished from the system between the ages of 18 and 22. Picture the sprawling footprints of the modern American megachurch: vast, cavernous auditoriums, specialized youth facilities equipped with concert-grade lighting, fog machines, and commercial pizza ovens. For decades, the public believed this massive infrastructure was the ultimate engine of institutional preservation. The operating assumption was purely transactional. If you entertain the youth, you retain the youth. But beneath the strobe lights and the synchronized soundboards, a silent demographic exodus was already fully in motion. To understand the sheer scale of this collapse, we must examine the architecture of the illusion itself. During the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, religious institutions stared down a rapidly altering cultural landscape. They were losing ground to MTV, video games, and the relentless acceleration of consumer entertainment. Panicked by the shifting attention spans of an entire demographic, the church initiated a massive, heavily funded strategic pivot toward the attractional model. This was the wholesale adoption of corporate business principles and mass marketing applied to theology. The formula was designed to incentivize spiritual compliance through games, retreats, and rock bands. Success was measured strictly by physical density. A crowded room was logged as a spiritual triumph. The institution was actively tracking bodily presence while remaining entirely blind to psychological disengagement. By commodifying the experience, the church entered a competition it could never mathematically win. It attempted to rival the global entertainment industry on its own terms, ultimately creating a manufactured liminal space. The masses of teenagers moving through these facilities were not being anchored to a historical tradition. They were being processed through a consumer pipeline, and the data clearly demonstrates that the moment the entertainment stopped, the audience simply walked away. The sheer weight of the statistics removes any room for anecdotal comfort. This is a systemic fracture, quantifiable down to the decimal. In 2007, Lifeway Research published findings that sent shockwaves through the ecclesiastical establishment, revealing that 70% of young adults dropped out of church for at least a year. In 2019, Lifeway updated this research, surveying over 2,000 young adults. The needle barely moved. The updated dropout rate sits permanently at 66%. The timeline of this departure is startlingly precise. According to the census data of this demographic, 69% of these youth are attending regularly at age 17. By age 18, the number plummets to 58%. By age 19, a mere 40% remain. The precise moment the mandatory structure of secondary education dissolves, the religious affiliation evaporates. Other major sociological research organizations verify this exact trajectory. The Fuller Youth Institute conducted a massive initiative known as the College Transition Project, revealing that 40 to 50% of teenagers who graduate from these highly funded youth programs fail to retain their affiliation in college. Barna Group's extensive polling corroborated this, establishing that 59% of young adults with a Christian background completely sever ties with the church during their 20s. For years, the institution insulated itself with the myth of the inevitable return. The comforting narrative assumed these individuals were merely taking a collegiate hiatus before returning to raise their own families. The demographic data violently rejects this. While 31% of dropouts eventually return as regular attenders, a staggering 39% attend infrequently, and 29% never return at all. We are observing the permanent migration of massive swaths of individuals out of the system. If this attractional infrastructure failed to transfer historical tenets, what exactly was it programming into the minds of its subjects? In 2005, sociologists Christian Smith and Melinda Lundquist-Denton released the National Study of Youth and Religion. Based on in-depth interviews with over 3,000 adolescents across 45 states, it remains arguably the most exhaustive investigation into the internal lives of American teenagers ever conducted. Smith uncovered a deeply disturbing reality. The vast majority of these teenagers lacked the basic vocabulary to even articulate the faith they supposedly held. Instead, researchers identified a new default belief system that had quietly colonized their psychology, a framework Smith termed Moralistic Therapeutic Deism. This is a highly watered-down, self-serving ideology defined by 5 core tenets. The first posits that a God exists who created the world. The second states that God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other. The third asserts that the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. The fourth suggests that God does not need to be particularly involved in a person's life except to resolve a problem. And the fifth claims that good people go to heaven when they die. This serves as the psychological autopsy of the youth group era. The institution intended to build resilient loyalty but instead manufactured a benign whateverism. Because the environment was engineered for comfort, it reinforced religion strictly as a tool for personal happiness and self-esteem elevation. The deity of Generation Z and Millennials was reduced to a cosmic butler, expected to remain in the background until summoned for a crisis. By stripping away theological depth in a desperate bid to remain culturally relevant, the institution rendered itself obsolete. If the primary goal of human existence is simply to be nice and feel happy, a sprawling, demanding religious infrastructure is entirely unnecessary. The youth did not rebel aggressively against the system. They simply realized it was irrelevant to the therapeutic worldview they had been taught within its very walls. The illusion persists within the institution that this exodus is merely a byproduct of geographical relocation to university campuses. That is a convenient fiction. While 34% of dropouts do cite moving to college as a factor, the internal data points to a much darker systemic rejection of the culture itself. The true engine of this mass departure is a profound crisis of authenticity. Generation Z and Millennials possess an acute, almost algorithmic sensitivity to institutional hypocrisy. According to Lifeway research, 32% of young adults who dropped out cited church members seeming judgmental or hypocritical as their primary reason for leaving. 29% reported feeling fundamentally disconnected from the people in the church, and 25% left due to disagreements over political and social issues. Barna Group's polling paints an even bleaker portrait of this relational collapse. Among millennials who do not attend church, an overwhelming 87% view Christians as judgmental, 85% perceive them as hypocritical, 91% view them as anti-homosexual, and 70% see them as insensitive to others. To a demographic that places absolute premium on transparency and inclusion, these metrics are catastrophic. This is the friction between the facade and the reality. The Attractional Model promised community and relevance. It delivered laser tag and pizza parties. When the masses grew into young adults grappling with complex psychological and social realities, they found the institution utterly hollow. The church spent unprecedented capital polishing its exterior, branding itself as a welcoming haven, but the demographic data proves the internal product was perceived as hostile and unauthentic. When 66% of surveyed millennials agree that American churchgoers are hypocritical, the system is no longer suffering a public relations problem. It is suffering a fundamental failure of structural integrity. They actively recoiled from an environment they deemed toxic. We are now witnessing the compounded interest of this strategic blunder. The failure to retain millennials has accelerated into a full-scale demographic collapse with Generation Z. Data from the front lines of sociological research indicates the baseline of American religious identity is shifting faster than the institutions can even track. The Barna Group officially classifies Generation Z as the first truly post-Christian generation in American history. The concept of a shared cultural religious foundation has been entirely erased. Currently, the percentage of Generation Z teens who identify as atheist is double that of the general adult population, sitting at 13%, compared to the adult baseline of 6%. Furthermore, 14% of these teenagers explicitly classify themselves as none of the above, denying any ideological alignment with any established religious framework. But the most jarring statistic, the metric that signals a permanent and irreversible alteration of the institutional landscape, is the unprecedented disaffiliation of young women. Historically, women have always been the most religious demographic, forming the reliable, unpaid backbone of church infrastructure. That reality is officially dead. According to a 2023 study published by Barna, a massive gender gap has emerged. 38% of Generation Z women between the ages of 18 and 24, now identify as religiously unaffiliated. This sits remarkably higher than their male peers, who report a 32% disaffiliation rate. Across every measured spiritual practice, these young adult women show the absolute lowest levels of engagement. Only 30% report attending a worship service in the last week. This is a catastrophic leading indicator. When the demographic that historically sustains the generational continuity of an institution begins to exit at a rate of nearly 40%, the structural integrity of the entire system is critically compromised. The statistics do not lie. The massive gamble on entertainment, the desperate attempts to mirror consumer culture, the creation of highly curated attractional environments, it all culminated in a catastrophic severing of generational continuity. The church built a massive, gleaming infrastructure designed to attract crowds, but neglected the mechanisms required to forge lasting substance. Now, the buildings remain. The auditoriums are still vast. The screens are still bright. But the demographics are shifting like sand beneath the foundations. As the last remnants of the attractional illusion fade away, we are left staring at vacant architectures and plummeting retention rates. An entire generation was processed through a consumer pipeline, offered a shallow imitation of meaning, and they recognized it for exactly what it was. What happens to an empire of vacant buildings when the massive, faceless audience it was built to entertain realizes they no longer need the show?